Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
We all know this speech. Across America, the phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," is synonymous with the beginning of World War II and Pearl Harbor. But in Evansville, it's even more. In Evansville, December 7th, 1941, signified the beginning of the most significant period in our city's history. It was the moment when we started to find our way out of the Depression. It was the moment that our population started to expand. It was the moment that an entire city pivoted on a dime and started building the hundreds of ships, thousands of planes, and billions of bullets that would help defeat one of the greatest evils in history. So tell me, does that sound like the Evansville we know today?
We did it because, again, it was one of those things we were supposed to do because we had to. Except, I'm going to use a comparison of trying to build a hotel and how many surveys and how many things they've gone through. You take Evansville. The war started. Within 6 months, you've taken an empty lot on the Ohio River and you're building ocean-going vessels. You took a refrigeration plant on 41 and you're building airplanes. And I don't know why you can't get that kind of stuff done today, but again, back there was no rules and regulations. You had to do it. They threw the rules out the window. You did it.
In 1941, here in Evansville, we did it. They made it happen. And what I want to emphasize is that it didn't just happen. There was nothing automatic about it happening. There were lots of places where it didn't happen. These orders could have gone elsewhere, and Evansville would have become a ghost town. But that didn't happen. What happened was that people of all shapes and sizes came together in this city. And what is so impressive about it is that the people who came together represent three groups of people who had a long history of mutual antagonism. They hated each other. The leaders of business, the leaders of the unions, and the leaders of the political parties. And yet they found a way in 1941 to forget all these old animosities, come together in the interests of this city, and make sure that orders came to Evansville for all of these war products. In so doing, these people managed to transform our city, and instead of becoming a ghost town, Evansville was to become a boom town.
I don't know if there's any other town in America our size that supplied as much material as we did.
The shipyards gets all the glory, if you will, and I think behind the shipyards is Servell.
Republic Aviation.
Bullets by the billions being produced at Chrysler.
Over 3 billion .45 caliber rounds were made at Evansville Chrysler.
Shane Uniform, they were making military uniforms.
Hugh Cyrus, Erie, and Shane Uniform, and Boots, and the steel companies.
People were coming from all over the United States to work in Evansville.
And what's amazing about it is that most of those factories and businesses that came almost as fast as they said it in that video. In February of 1942, Valentine's Day, actually, the Navy announced that it would build an inland shipyard here in Evansville. There they would go on to build 167 landing ship tanks, the ship that you could make the argument won World War II for the Allies. Hitler didn't have a ship like this. He wasn't able to take his heavy artillery and his tanks to England, which was why he could only bomb there. We wanted to be able to do that in places like Normandy and Iwo Jima. The LSTs let us take those tanks and that heavy artillery onto the beaches and successfully handle those invasions. A month after they announced the shipyard, it was announced that Republic Aviation would locate on North 41 in the plant we now know as the old Whirlpool plant. There they would go on to build thousands of P-47 fighter planes for use in the Allied war effort. And those were only the two new businesses. Businesses all over Evansville pivoted to war production once the war began. International Steel started supplying steel for the shipyards to go into the LSTs. Companies like Servell and Hoosier Cardinal started making airplane elevators and airplane wings that went on the P-47s. Companies like Bucyrus Erie and Shane Uniform, as Tom Lomberg said, pivoted into war production. But maybe no company was as great an example as Chrysler, a company you know today for making cars, a company they knew then for making cars. In 1942, stopped making cars, and they started making bullets. It became Evansville Ordnance, where they made 96% of the .45 caliber ammunition used by the Allies in World War II. 96%. That's an incredible statistic and something Evansville should be very proud of. And of course, in order to make all of these things, they needed the workforce to do it. People came from all over the country to work in Evansville, but it wasn't the traditional workforce of the time because all of the men were going to war. So now all of a sudden, women were a major part of the workforce. As the one person we interviewed said, this was the time when women came out of the kitchen and went to work. At one point, it was estimated that a third of the industrial workers in Indiana during the war were women. At Republic Aviation, that number was as many as half. And women weren't the only ones who suddenly found themselves with new opportunities because of the war. The African American population in Evansville suddenly found opportunities that they hadn't had before. But it's important to note that their opportunities were not the same as those that were offered to women or that were offered to white men. Which makes this a good time for us to point out, we're not suggesting that Evansville in the 1940s was this wonderful slice of Americana. There were problems and there were challenges. Even just finding places to house all of these people who were coming here was a challenge, as you'll hear in this video.
In 1942, the first full year of the war, Evansville ended up going from 18,000 regular industrial plant employees to 84,000 men and women working here. Can you imagine? That's a fourfold or fivefold increase in employment. Where are they going to live? Where are they going to sleep?
Housing must have been a mess.
The town filled up. There was not a hotel room. There wasn't a rental property available.
People came, they didn't know where to sleep or anything.
You get people living in trailers and people living in converted garages and people living in the spare bedroom.
The Carlton and Grand Theaters had extra hours so people working at the shipyard could get off shift, come to Grand Theater and go in and pay admission and sleep. The Carlton Theater was open early in the morning. The Grand Theater stayed open late at night till the next morning. And there was only about a 2 or 3 hour gap where you could not go to the Grand or Carlton and get a full day's sleep.
People were doing all kinds of things. They were rehabbing chicken houses in the back of their house and turning them into apartments.
Mom used to hot bunk. She would rent a bed. She wouldn't rent an apartment. She rented a bed. She would rent it for 8 hours, and when she would get out, another shipyard worker would get in the bunk, and then after that, another one.
Now, where they changed the sheets in the meantime, I don't know.
The famous stories that you always hear about people renting a bed and the night shift worker would sleep in it during the day and the day shift worker would sleep in it during the night. I never know if that's true or not, but I think that if it's not true, it at least illustrates the level of desperation that people had when it came to just find a place to sleep, find a place to stay.
I'm supposed to talk now about challenges and mistakes. Sharing a bed with 2 sweaty shipyard workers sounds to me like both a challenge and a mistake. We made plenty of mistakes though, and as alluded to earlier, racism was one of them. Evansville remained a racist town through this time, remained a largely segregated city. White workers went on strike rather than work with black workers on occasion. And we didn't just put people up in chicken coops and trailers. In the end, the city built 6 enormous federal housing projects to house some of these workers. But once you build these projects, how do these workers get to where they're going to work? The transport infrastructure was strained enormously throughout this whole period. And these workers brought their kids too. Where are they going to go to school? How are they going to get to school? How are they going to get school lunches when they get there? And remember that all of this was happening incredibly quickly. And with that, there were accidents. Across the United States, over 11 million serious injury industrial accidents took place. And what happens when thousands of young men come into a city on a weekend looking for something to do? Well, in Evansville, we saw an enormous red light district develop. There were at least 30 houses of ill repute doing good business on every weekend. But all of these challenges didn't stop us doing what we had to do. The city dealt with the problems as they could, and they continued to produce the vital war material for the war effort. The housing, schooling, and transportation problems were largely solved. The problem of prostitution was kind of solved, and the problem of racism, that wasn't solved at all. It was passed on to another generation.
And we're not trying to brush any of these situations under the rug. They were serious issues, and they needed to be dealt with. Some of them we're still dealing with today, as you heard in the previous talk. But at that time, America's efforts, Evansville's efforts, had to be focused on defeating Hitler and the evil posed by the Axis powers. And Evansville was willing to do whatever it had to do to make this happen. You already know that meant going to work in record numbers. But it also meant volunteering in record numbers. When people clocked out, they went to volunteer at places like the Red Cross, the USO, and other places that were dedicated to helping our soldiers and helping the war effort. These people sacrificed in ways that we can't even imagine. Today, we go to war overseas, and unless you have a family member serving in the military, the war probably doesn't come into your home. Maybe in the newspaper, maybe on television. But World War II came into everyone's home every day. It came in the form of rationing. People gave up sugar. People gave up gasoline. Most households only got 3 gallons of gas per week. Women gave up nylons because the material was being used to make parachutes. And when they could get them, that's what the line looked like. People couldn't buy belts. They couldn't buy clothes. People gave up coffee. Coffee. The only reason most of you are still awake to hear me talk right now. And while people were making these sacrifices, they opened up their wallets. Americans bought billions of dollars in war bonds, which sounds like a pretty simple thing to us because you think, okay, you buy a bond, you help support the war effort, and then after the war's over, you get your money back with interest. But that's only if you win. And remember that we didn't know at this time that they were going to win. In fact, for a good part of 1942, it looked like we probably weren't going to win. But these people took that leap of faith because they knew that no great thing could be done without some great risk. So they took the risk. Of course, we now know in hindsight that we did win the war. And all of those people who did all of those amazing things here in Evansville, they went on to build the Evansville that we know today because they stayed. They started businesses. They got married. They took what was a small German town and grew it into a much larger, much more diverse, still mostly German town. You know these people. These people are your neighbors. They were your teachers. They were your coaches. They're your grandparents.
Between 1941 and 1945, the people of Evansville faced the greatest challenge of the last 200 years. And in response to that, they came together, they transformed the city, and they helped to save the world. Now, we don't need a huge challenge like that for us to come together. We think that all we need is a common goal, the goal of making this city in which we live the best it can possibly be. And it's not just a dream, is it? All around us, we see it happening. The people of Evansville coming together to transform our city once again. And we think the lesson of our talk here is that if this is going to happen, we're going to have to work together. We're going to have to overcome old animosities. We're going to have to take risks and make sacrifices. We're going to have to face up to challenges. We're going to make mistakes. There will be misjudgments. But we have to learn from them and move on. 75 years ago, the people of Evansville showed that it could be done. It can be, no, it is being done again today. Thank you.